Cranial cavity is main cavity of the skull. It lodges the brain, meninges, portion of cranial nerves and blood vessels. It is roofed over by skull cap and its floor is formed by upper surface of base of skull. Skull cap calvaria. It is also called vault of skull, formed by superior portion of frontal, parietal and occipital bones. Internal surface. The internal surface of a skull or calvaria appears as an ovoid hollow plate of bone and has their features: coronal, sagittal and lambdoid sutures, sagittal sulcus, granular pits, vascular grooves, parietal foramina, impressions for cerebral gyri, frontal crest, frontal bone, groove for meningeal vessels, coronal suture, sagittal suture, groove for superior sagittal sinus, sagittal suture, granular pits for arachnoid granulation, parietal bone, parietal foramen, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, parietal foramens. Structures. Cranial vault consists of outer and inner layers of compact bone, generally called outer and inner tables, with an innervating layer of spongy bone called diploe. Outer table is thick, resilient and tough. Inner table is thin and brittle. Diploic veins. The blood from diploe is drained by diploic veins. These veins drain mostly into intracranial dural venous sinuses. Recognizable diploid veins are usually 4 on each side. Frontal diploic veins, anterior temporal diploic vein, posterior temporal diploic vein, occipital diploic vein. Frontal diploic vein, occipital diploic vein, posterior temporal diploic vein, anterior temporal diploic vein. Floor of cranial cavity divided into 3 descending steps by 2 ridges. Lesser wing of the sphenoid is sphenoidal ridge, superior border of petrous temporal bone, petrous ridge. 3 steps are known as anterior, middle and posterior cranial fossa. Roof of cranial cavity, frontal lobe of cerebral hemisphere, anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, temporal lobe of cerebral hemisphere, midbrain, floor of cranial cavity, posterior cranial fossa, cerebellum, tentorium cerebelli. The internal surface of the base of the skull is divided into the anterior, medial and posterior cranial fossa. They are arranged like 3 terraces with descending levels. Frontal air sinus, frontal crest, foramen cecum, nasal slit, anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramina, crista galli, optic foramina, foramen rotundum, hypophyseal fossa, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen lacerum, jugular foramen, cerebellar fossa, internal occipital crest, foramen magnum, groove for transverse sinus, groove for sigmoid sinus, superior border of petrous temporal bone, hypoglossal canal, internal auditory meatus, dorsum cellae, posterior clinoid process, anterior clinoid process, superior orbital fissure, posterior border of lesser wing of the sphenoid, nasal slit, anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramina, frontal crest and foramen cecum, frontal air sinuses. Anterior cranial fossa lodges frontal lobe of cerebral hemisphere's 3 bones, ethmoid, frontal and sphenoid. It is demarcated from middle cranial fossa by posterior free border of lesser wing of sphenoid on each side. Anterior border of the sulcus schizmatus in median ridge lock, crista galli, frontal crest, cribriform plate, anterior clinoid process, lesser wing. Features. The anterior cranial fossa presents the following features: median ridge, frontal crest, foramen cecum, crista galli, comb-like structure formed by ethmoid, crista galli formed by ethmoid, jugular sphenoidal, jugum sphenoidal, superior surface of anterior part of the body of sphenoid, small foramina 15 to 24, olfactory nerve, nasal slits, anterior ethmoidal canal for ethmoidal nerves and vessel, frontal bone, olfactory nerve, olfactory bulb, foramina of cribriform plate, ethmoidal bone, Sphenoid bone, optic canal, superior orbital features. Structure passing foramen cecum, emissary vein from nasal mucus to anterior end of superior sagittal sinus if foramen is patent. Cribriform foramina, olfactory nerve surrounded by leptomeninges, pia and arachnoid nerves from olfactory epithelium of nasal cavity to ophthalmic bulb in anterior cranial fossa. Anterior ethmoidal foramen, anterior ethmoidal nerve, a branch of nasociliary nerve, anterior ethmoidal artery, a branch of ophthalmic artery, anterior ethmoidal vein, a tributary of ophthalmic vein. Posterior ethmoidal foramen, posterior ethmoidal nerve, a branch of nasociliary nerve, posterior ethmoidal artery, a branch of ophthalmic artery, posterior ethmoidal vein, a tributary of ophthalmic vein. Clinical. Foramen cecum may transmit an emissary vein from the nasal cavity to the superior sagittal sinus and then serves as a potential route for nasal infections to spread to meninges or the cranial cavity. Thank you.